There are some stories that don't survive in records, not because they weren't important, but because someone made sure they wouldn't. In the spring of 1849, a courthouse in rural Alabama burned to the ground. Officials called it an accident, a simple fire, nothing unusual, but when the ashes cooled, something didn't make sense. Hidden beneath the collapsed structure in a section no one was supposed to notice, they found remains, more than one, and not just buried, restrained. As if whatever happened there was never meant to leave that room. Along with the bodies, the records were gone, land ownership, legal disputes, family histories, all erased. And with them, an entire story disappeared, or at least that's what people believed, because fragments survived, letters that didn't burn, testimonies that weren't meant to be heard. Whispers passed quietly through generations. And when those fragments are placed together, they reveal something far more unsettling. Not just what happened on one plantation, but how far people were willing to go to control everything around them. 2 years before that fire, there was a death, unexpected, sudden. A man known for control lost it completely. His name was Nathaniel Sutton, a plantation owner, a strategist, a man who believed the world could be organized if you were willing to treat people like variables. He didn't just run a plantation, he studied it, recorded everything, measured behavior, tracked outcomes. To him, nothing was random. Everything could be shaped. Everything could be improved. He had 2 daughters, Sarah and Catherine. They were raised inside that system, educated, refined, but never free because in his eyes they weren't exceptions. They were part of the design. They learned quickly how to observe, how to stay silent, how to understand without being seen understanding. And most importantly, how control actually works. By the time they reached adulthood, they didn't just live inside a system. They understood it, and once you understand a system, you can change it. The morning he died, everything shifted. No struggle, no warning, just a man found alone mid-thought with his final sentence unfinished. Officially, it was natural. That's what people were told, and that's what people accepted, because questioning it would have required looking deeper. And no one wanted to do that. At the funeral, the daughters stood side by side, calm, composed, not grieving the way people expected. But not surprised either. And that detail didn't go unnoticed, because it felt like they already knew. Then came the will, and with it, a set of conditions that changed everything. They would inherit everything, the land, the wealth, the entire system their father built, but only if they followed his rules. They had limited time to marry, to produce heirs, to prove they could continue his legacy. And if they failed, everything would be taken from them. It was control even after death. Final attempt to dictate their future. And for a moment it seemed like it would work, because from the outside they complied, they followed the structure, they began making arrangements, they played their roles. But what no one realized was that they weren't submitting. They were adapting because they had learned something their father never expected. Control doesn't require obedience, it requires understanding. And once you understand the rules, you can bend them. The turning point came with a single decision. A calculated one, a dangerous one, because instead of following the system, they chose to manipulate it. And to do that, they needed someone unexpected, someone intelligent, someone observant, someone who understood survival. That person arrived at an auction, not as a participant, as property. But from the moment he stepped forward, it was clear he wasn't what anyone expected. Because while others looked defeated, he was watching, analyzing, measuring, just like they were. And in that moment, everything changed, because they didn't just see a solution, they saw an opportunity, and what they did next would reshape everything. Not just their future, but the fate of everyone connected to them. The auction didn't feel unusual, that was the problem. People gathered the same way they always did. Casual, routine, as if nothing important was happening, but beneath that surface everything was being decided. Lives, futures, control, all reduced to numbers. Sarah and Catherine stood just outside the crowd, not hidden, but not drawing attention either. They had learned long ago visibility wasn't power. Positioning was. They watched everything, not emotionally, structurally, who bid quickly, who hesitated, who calculated value, and who reacted to impulse. Because those details mattered, patterns always mattered. Then something shifted, not in the crowd, on the platform. A man stepped forward, calm, steady, not performing, not resisting, observing. And that was unusual, because most people placed there had already been broken into compliance. But this was different. He wasn't avoiding eye contact. He was making it, not challenging, measuring. Sarah noticed first. A slight pause in her breathing, a shift in focus, because she recognized something, not familiarity, structure. Catherine followed her gaze, watched for a moment, then understood. "He's not reacting," she said quietly. "He's analyzing." Sarah nodded. And in that moment, they made a decision, not emotional, not impulsive, calculated. The bidding started slowly. Most people weren't interested. Intelligence made things complicated, unpredictable, and unpredictability was risk. But Sarah and Catherine weren't avoiding risk. They were selecting it. The price climbed. Higher than expected, higher than reasonable, and still they didn't stop, because they weren't buying labor, they were investing in possibility. When it ended, they had him. And with that, the system shifted. He arrived at the plantation days later, walked in not as someone defeated, but as someone aware. Aware of where he was, aware of what it meant, and most importantly, aware that nothing about this situation was normal. They didn't delay the conversation, no formal introduction, no unnecessary structure, just clarity. "You understand why you're here," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her, carefully. "I understand this isn't typical," he replied. That was enough. They explained the situation, not everything, but enough. A system with rules, conditions that had to be met, a timeline that couldn't be extended, and a need for precision. He listened without interrupting, not because he agreed, but because he was evaluating, just like they had. "What you're asking," he said finally, "is dangerous." Sarah didn't argue. "Everything here is dangerous," she replied. "That's not new." There was a pause. Not uncertainty, calculation, because now he understood the real situation. This wasn't about survival, it was about leverage, and leverage always comes with risk. "What happens if it works?" he asked. "You walk away," Catherine said, "with something you don't have now." Freedom wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. "And if it fails?" No one answered immediately, because that outcome didn't need explanation. The silence lasted just long enough. Then he nodded, not agreement. Acceptance, and just like that, the alliance formed, not built on trust, not built on loyalty, built on necessity. At first, everything was controlled, structured interactions, clear boundaries, defined roles, because that's how systems function best, with limits, with rules, with predictable outcomes. But over time, those boundaries started to shift, not dramatically, subtly, because when people operate inside a system long enough, they start influencing it, changing it. He gained access. Information, records, details that weren't meant to be seen. And what he found changed his understanding completely. Because this wasn't just a plantation, it was something else. Something designed, something controlled, something that had been operating long before he arrived. And the deeper he looked, the more he realized this wasn't just their father's system. It was something bigger, something connected, something that extended beyond one place into something far more structured. But there was something else, something unexpected. The sisters weren't just maintaining the system. They were changing it, not in obvious ways, but in decisions, small ones at first, then larger ones, and those changes created tension, because systems don't adjust without resistance, and resistance was already building. The outside world started noticing. Questions were asked, timelines examined, details compared. And slowly attention began to shift toward them, which meant one thing. Time was running out, and the system they were trying to control was about to push back. At first, the records didn't seem unusual, just ledgers, schedules, entries organized with precision, numbers aligned, dates consistent. Outcomes recorded without commentary. It looked efficient, controlled, exactly what you'd expect from someone like Nathaniel Sutton. But the deeper he looked, the more something felt off, not because of what was written, because of what wasn't. Gaps, sections missing context, entries that ended too cleanly, outcomes without explanation. And in a system built on control, missing information is never accidental, it's intentional. He started cross-referencing, comparing dates, matching names, tracking sequences across different books. And slowly a pattern began to form, not visible at first, but once seen impossible to ignore. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly, not in the same way, not in the same role, but always connected. And over time they disappeared, not recorded as gone, not marked as moved, just no longer present. At first it looked like coincidence. Then it started to look like selection, and finally it became clear. This wasn't documentation, it was tracking. He brought the information to Sarah first, not as accusation, as observation. "These entries don't close properly," he said. "They transition." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She looked at the pages, then at him. And for the first time, there was something different in her expression, not surprise, recognition. Catherine joined shortly after. They reviewed everything together, not emotionally, structurally, breaking it down, rebuilding it until the pattern became undeniable. Their father hadn't just been managing a plantation. He had been studying people, testing behavior, recording responses, and adjusting outcomes. "This wasn't about production," Catherine said quietly. "It was about control." Sarah nodded. But there was something else, something deeper, because control alone didn't explain the gaps. The disappearances, the unfinished records, they needed more information, and that meant going somewhere their father never intended them to look. The lower level of the main house wasn't part of daily use. It wasn't locked, but it wasn't accessed either, because some spaces don't need barriers, they create their own. The air was different there, heavier, still, unmoved by time. Shelves lined the walls. Boxes stacked with precision, and inside more records, but these weren't organized the same way. These were detailed, personal, specific names, observations, behavioral notes, and outcomes written in a way that left no room for interpretation. This wasn't management, it was experimentation. Every entry followed a structure, condition, response, adjustment, outcome, repeated, refined, improved. And the more they read, the clearer it became. Their father hadn't been controlling a system. He had been building one. He was testing limits, he said quietly, seeing how far he could push things. Catherine turned a page slowly. He wasn't just observing behavior, she said. He was creating it. That realization changed everything, because now this wasn't about inheritance, it wasn't about survival. It was about understanding what they had stepped into, and whether they were continuing it without realizing it. The tension shifted immediately, not between them, within them. Because once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you understand a system, you have to decide what to do with it. That was the fracture point. Sarah saw opportunity, structure, a system that could be refined, improved, controlled differently. Catherine saw something else, consequence, a pattern that shouldn't continue, something that needed to end. And he stood between them because he understood both, the logic and the cost. "What happens if we keep going?" he asked. No one answered immediately, because the answer was already visible. The system would expand, become more precise, more efficient, more controlled, and the people inside it would become less and less relevant. That was the moment everything changed, because now this wasn't just about what they could do. It was about what they were willing to become. Outside, the pressure was building, questions, observations, patterns noticed by people who didn't belong inside the system but were close enough to see its effects. And once that happens, time becomes limited, because systems like this don't collapse slowly, they break all at once. Pressure doesn't always arrive loudly, sometimes it builds in silence. A question asked once, then again, a detail noticed, then compared, and slowly what was once contained begins to surface. That's what was happening now, not inside the system, outside of it. At first it was small, a missing record, a timeline that didn't match. A name that appeared, then disappeared without explanation. Nothing definitive, but enough to create doubt. And doubt is where investigations begin. Local officials didn't act immediately. They observed, collected, compared, because stepping too early would mean stepping without proof. And systems like this don't leave obvious proof behind, but patterns leave traces, and those traces were starting to connect. Inside the plantation, the tension was different, not external, internal. Because now they all understood what they were dealing with, not just a system, a structure that had already been tested, refined, proven to work, and that created a choice: continue it or end it. Sarah didn't hesitate. "This can be improved," she said, her tone steady, focused, controlled more precisely. "Refined." Catherine shook her head. "It shouldn't exist at all," her voice quieter but firm. "This isn't structure," she said. "It's damage." The room fell silent because both of them were right. And that was the problem. He stepped in carefully. "We don't have time to argue theory," he said. "Something is already moving outside this place. And once it reaches here, we won't get another chance to decide." That shifted the focus, because now this wasn't just about control, it was about timing. The decision couldn't wait, and whatever they chose would define everything that followed. That's when Sarah made the first move, not announced, not discussed, executed. She adjusted the system, subtly. Not enough to be noticed immediately, but enough to change outcomes. She removed variables, tightened processes, increased predictability, because in her mind this wasn't about morality, it was about precision. Catherine saw it immediately. "You're continuing it," she said, not angry, certain. Sarah didn't deny it. "I'm controlling it," she replied. "That's the difference." But Catherine understood something Sarah didn't. Control doesn't erase consequence, it amplifies it. That realization led to the second decision. Not structured, not calculated, emotional, and that made it dangerous. Catherine began removing records, quietly, systematically, breaking connections, disrupting patterns, introducing gaps, because if the system couldn't hold itself together, it couldn't continue. He noticed the shift between them, two directions, both intentional, both irreversible, and both moving toward collision. Outside, the investigation advanced. Questions became direct. Visits became more frequent, and attention became unavoidable. One official arrived unannounced, not aggressive but deliberate. He asked simple questions, routine ones, but the way he asked them made it clear. He wasn't guessing, he was confirming. That was the moment everything accelerated. Because once confirmation begins, time disappears, and decisions become immediate. That night they faced the reality they had been avoiding. The system couldn't continue, and it couldn't simply be abandoned. Because anything left behind could be reconstructed, understood, used again. "So what do we do?" Catherine asked. No one answered right away, because the answer was obvious but difficult. To end the system, they would have to destroy it completely, not just the records, not just the structure, everything. And once that decision is made, there's no reversal, because destruction is final. The fire wasn't an accident, it wasn't sudden, and it wasn't uncontrolled, it was planned, timed. Executed with the same precision the system was built on. Flames moved through the structure quickly, consuming records, breaking connections, erasing patterns. But destruction has a cost, because while systems can be removed, their effects remain. And once something has existed, it can't be undone. By morning, the plantation was gone, reduced to ash, and with it, everything that could explain what had happened there. Officially, it was an accident, just like the courthouse would be years later. Just like every system that disappears without explanation. But the truth was something else entirely, because what they destroyed wasn't just a place, it was an idea, And ideas don't burn. By morning, there was nothing left to examine. No structure, no records, no system, just ash. And a version of events simple enough to accept. An accident, a fire that spread too quickly, a loss that couldn't be prevented. That's what people were told. And that's what people believed. Because it was easier. Because the alternative would have required asking questions no one wanted to answer. Officials arrived late, too late to find anything intact, too late to reconstruct what had been there. They documented what they could, not much. A structure burned, property lost, cause undetermined, and then the report was closed. But closure doesn't mean understanding. It just means no one is looking anymore. The sisters disappeared soon after, not publicly, not dramatically. Quietly, as if they had never intended to stay. No forwarding address. No official departure, just absence. He left as well, not immediately, but soon enough, because there was nothing left to remain for. No system to navigate, no structure to analyze, only consequence. And consequence doesn't need a place to exist. Years passed, the land changed, new ownership, new purpose, new routines, and eventually no visible trace remained. Because time doesn't preserve systems, it replaces them. But something else remained, not physical, not documented, conceptual, because what had been built there didn't disappear. It proved something simple, something dangerous, that human behavior can be measured, that systems can be constructed, and that outcomes can be shaped. That idea doesn't stay contained. It spreads quietly, through observation, through repetition, through anyone willing to look closely enough. And that's the part no one talks about, not the fire. Not the destruction, but the fact that it worked. That a system like that could exist, could function, could remain hidden for as long as it did. Because if something like that can exist once, it can exist again, not in the same form, not in the same place, but built on the same understanding, the same structure, the same logic. And logic doesn't disappear, it evolves, it adapts, it becomes more efficient, more precise, more invisible. So the story isn't about what happened there. It's about what was learned. Because once a system is understood, it doesn't need to be rediscovered. It only needs to be applied. And that raises a question, not about the past, but about the present. How many systems exist now built on the same principles, operating quietly without being noticed? Because the most effective systems don't stand out. They blend in. They function within what people expect. And by the time they're recognized, they've already shaped the outcome. That's what makes them powerful. Not visibility, not force, but precision. Because when something becomes precise enough, it doesn't need control. It only needs one thing, for no one to question it.